From the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston, Texas, this is Baker Briefing. I'm Ed Emmett. I'm a Baker Institute Fellow in Energy and Transportation Policy. And here at the Baker Institute, we tackle the most critical foreign and domestic policy issues of the day and hopefully of the future too. Today's topic is local. It's Houston. And who better to talk about Houston than Ruth Lopez Turley, Director of Kinder Institute for Urban Research, and Daniel Potter, the Senior Director of Research at the Kinder Institute. Houston has been called a microcosm of America's future because it's so diverse, it's so dynamic in terms of the changes in the economy here and the culture. But it's also home to the Kinder Houston Area Survey. And for those who don't know, it's been around, 42 years? The nation's longest running metropolitan study of its kind. And it tends to look at what are the attitudes, concerns, and priorities of this culturally diverse city in the entire metropolitan area. But more importantly, by focusing on the same questions roughly over the years, you get to see how attitudes change. And I don't think that's occurred anywhere else in the country. So Ruth and Daniel, thank you for walking across the street from the Kinder Institute here to the Baker Institute. Let's start with you, Ruth. Tell us about the Houston Area Survey. What's its purpose?
Well, first of all, Ed, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to have taken that long walk across the street. And we're always so happy to collaborate with the Baker Institute, and we look forward to much more collaboration. But to answer your question about the Kinder Houston Area Survey, as you mentioned, it has been going for 42 years now. It is definitely the longest running survey of its kind in any city or metro area in the country, and we're extremely proud of that. But one of the things that I think that in and of itself makes it really special, but one additional thing that makes it really special is the fact that we have been changing so much. We, the Houston area, has been changing so much that it's just wonderful that we have had this survey to document all those changes, the demographic changes, in addition to the changes in attitudes and perceptions and opinions on the things that matter.
Good. So this year, the 2023 survey results were released this week.
Yes.
What are the outstanding issues?
Lots of things to mention there, but maybe I'll start off by highlighting one thing that I personally really appreciated seeing, and then I'll let Dan talk about what he personally appreciated seeing. But I was especially struck, as you know, I'm a sociologist, and I care deeply about inequalities in our community. And of course, the survey captured some of those ongoing and persistent inequalities that are actually not unique to Houston. They're prevalent all over the country. But what really jumped out at me is that for the first time, at least in this survey, a large proportion, the largest proportion that we've seen of respondents across all groups say they want to see action taken to close income gaps. So on the one hand, the inequalities persist. On the other hand, for the first time, we're seeing a large majority, it was 72%, a large majority of respondents are saying they want to see action taken. And I think that's a good first step. It's an opportunity to actually start to address these inequalities in a serious way, because we had not seen that before. We had not seen the majority of respondents saying that they actually want to do something about it.
Very interesting. So, Dan, since you're I'll use the term resident survey geek here.
That's the technical term.
That's the technical term. People always want to know, well, I didn't get surveyed, so who did get surveyed? Why is the Kinder survey so well respected and accepted?
So first, to echo Ruth, thank you, Ed, for having us here to have a chance to share out about our research. And so the Kinder Houston Area Survey over the last 40 years has evolved in how we are hearing from Houston. Back when it was started by Dr. Steve Kleinberg, you were able to call up households on the phone, and lo and behold, people would pick up. That has ceased to happen. If I don't recognize that caller ID, and sometimes even if I do, I am not picking up the phone. So we had to think about different ways. We had to evolve. And so more recently, we have shifted to using online surveys. And what we're doing in order to be able to connect to people online is we're reaching out to addresses around the Houston area. We're randomly selecting. So going through and doing a bunch of little statistics in the background, selecting households, reaching out to them in the mail, and asking them to go online and answer the survey. And while that online space is limiting for some folks, what it does is it gives us an opportunity to let people answer answer the survey on their own schedule. And it also allows for us to administer the survey in multiple languages. And so right now, it's in English and Spanish, and that allows for our two primary languages here in the Houston area. We are exploring other ones as well, but it allows for our respondents to really engage with this on their terms. And so using those methods, we've been able to develop a panel of 3,200 people that is representative of Houston and Harris County. And not only are we doing the Kinder Houston area survey with that panel, we're going to be going back to them multiple times a year. So we're not just hearing from them once, we're going to keep hearing from them over time.
Good. I think that's important to continuously update. And since we've been talking about the changes that have occurred over those 42 years, this year's standout responses are striking. They're interesting. But those of us who have been around long enough to see all the surveys, I'm fascinated by the changes from year to year. For example, in years past, crime has shown up as the big issue. Some years, health care. Immediately after the floods of Harvey, guess what? It was flooding. Why do these issues sort of disappear? I mean, I was at the luncheon where you unveiled the results. No mention of crime, no mention of health care. Why is that, do you think?
Well, these issues, it's interesting in how these issues come and go, or they're elevated at times and at other times not so much. And you're absolutely right that a big factor has to do with the circumstances, the current events or recent events, and that certainly has an impact on how people perceive the big issues. What's interesting about crime is that, and I know you know this, perceptions of crime don't always align with the reality of crime, or at least based on crime statistics, crime rates, and they're not perfect either, but when they're going up, it doesn't necessarily mean that the perceptions of crime are also going up and vice versa. But having said that, we think perceptions of crime are absolutely important in and of themselves, aside from actual crime rates. But having said that, what really stood out this year as a really important issue that hadn't stood out as much in the past was housing costs and instability. That used to be, just in 2022, it was what, 7%?
Yeah.
7%. And
non-existent before then.
Yeah.
Largely non-existent.
Right. Nobody chose housing costs and instability as the biggest problem facing our region. But this year, 1 in 5 respondents chose housing costs and instability as the biggest problem facing our region. So that really stood out to me. So on the one, you're mentioning those that have gone out of style, if you will. At the same time, there are other issues that have come into play much more prominently than before. But there is a reason for that. As I mentioned earlier, it's interesting that crime perceptions don't always align with what's actually happening with the crime rates. But in terms of housing costs, I do believe that it does align with what is happening in Houston right now, because there is evidence that shows that it is much harder to own a home today than it used to be. I mentioned at the luncheon that the median home price in Houston used to be about 3 times what the average person earned in a year. And it held there for many decades. It was pretty stable for a long time, but now that number is 5 times what the average person earns in a year. And that's a significant difference, and I think people are feeling it.
Well, that leads me to kind of a question either one of you can take on. COVID. During the pandemic, local governments actually had to step in and help people with their rent. And so housing suddenly became, I guess, maybe more visible. Is that an impact of COVID? And what else did the COVID pandemic cause in terms of survey results this year, do you think?
So the pandemic, the way in which it may have influenced people's views on housing, I want to say remains unclear, because if you look at sort of the trend in housing prices, Houston was experiencing increases in housing prices, putting home ownership further and further out of reach. Going back to 2015, 2016, and 17 was this really ramping up period going on. That, of course, continued and you could say accelerated through the pandemic, so it for sure didn't help the situation here in the Houston space. The pandemic absolutely disrupted the Houston economy. 500,000 jobs gone, so almost overnight during spring of 2020. Now, since then, you have 600,000 that have come back. And so on the one hand, you might look around and go, look at that Houston economy churning, really revving up and growing. And okay, cool, great, yes. At the exact same time, that whiplash in the economy was something that was very, very stressful and anxiety provoking, particularly for people who just are not in a position to handle those types of economic bursts and breaks. And pair that with inflation over the last couple of years, that coming out of the pandemic, as jobs started coming back, prices started soaring and wages grew. They did not keep up with what inflation was doing. And so as much as people might have been making money, that paycheck at the end of the week was not having the same buying power for folks. So you had these types of stresses and strains being placed on families that really brought forefront and center economics and finances for folks. And the cost of housing absolutely contributes into that space. As rent rates were going up, housing prices continued to go up. It is a lot of interconnected things. And so for sure, COVID did nothing to help housing. I think for sure, COVID plus inflation really, really did shake people's finances.
If I may add that what Dan just said about the combination of COVID and then the following inflation increases, if I had to speculate about why it is that so many more respondents, as I said earlier, want to see action taken to close income gaps, I suspect that the pandemic and inflation increases had something to do with that people are recognizing that there are these factors that are well beyond individuals' control, such as the pandemic and such as inflation, that make people much more aware and much more really wanting to do something about it and having actual government intervention to help close these gaps. So I suspect that that was one impact of the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, how many people thought people were poor because they're not working hard, they're not pulling themselves up, and if they just worked harder, they could? And the pandemic revealed, I mean, of those 500,000 jobs that disappeared, how many of those people the day before would have looked you dead in the eye and said, I have a secure job, I'm showing up every day, I'm working hard, I'm clocking in, I'm clocking out, I'm doing what I need to do, and that job is just pulled out right from under them for nothing that they did.
Sure,
right?
I mean, it could easily be people who, like you said, suddenly went, oh, there but for fate go I. Okay, Ruth, you are, I think I can say this, a noted expert on public education. Here in the Houston area, the takeover of Houston Independent School District, public education in the past has been an issue that showed up a lot. Did it show up at all on this year's survey? And if not, why do you think that is?
We actually didn't have very many questions on this year's survey that explicitly focused on education. The persistent challenge that we face every year, and that is that we have to decide what to include and what not to include. And on the one hand, we want some consistency across time. On the other hand, every year we like to include new items, and we should talk about the new items for this year in a little bit if you want. But at the same time, we have to keep it short, or at least as short as we can possibly manage to make sure that those response rates stay high. So having said all that, we did not focus very much on education in the 2023 survey. But I will say, though, that as you know, the Kinder Institute has an education research team, HERC, the Houston Education Research Consortium, which has produced a lot and is producing a lot of research briefs focusing on education in Houston, specifically in collaboration with our school district partners. There are 11 Houston area school districts that partner with us. So there's a lot of information there that I would encourage folks to take a look at. The other thing that I should mention is that since Dan referred to the panel that we've set up, 3,200 Harris County residents, in the first quarter of each year, we will be administering the Kinder Houston Area Survey to this panel, but in subsequent quarters, we'll administer additional surveys on special topics. So that leaves us with ample opportunity to do a deep dive into education at some point if we decide to do that. And by the way, I should define who we is. We at the Kinder Institute work very hard to consult with our community, lots of organizations, lots of folks around in the community, to determine what should those topics be, what should we focus on, what's important to people. So if that's an important topic, we would love to take a deep dive at some point. But no, this year's survey did not focus on education.
Well, since you teed it up so nicely, what changes do you see coming to the Kinder Houston Area Survey?
So there are a couple of changes that are worth highlighting that I think some folks would be interested in. The first is that we are planning to double at least actually double the size of that panel. Dan mentioned earlier it's currently at 3,200, but we intend to bring that up to at least 6,000 Harris County residents in the next year. And that's an important detail because right now with 3,200 we can draw conclusions about Harris County as a whole, but that sample size is not quite large enough to really allow us to zoom into specific neighborhoods within Harris County. With 6,000 or more, we should be able to do that. And lots of people have come to us over the years saying they really would like to learn more about specific neighborhoods. So that's one change that is coming. And the other change is that we are expanding. We're planning to expand the Kinder Houston Area Survey to include Fort Bend and Montgomery counties. And the part that I'm especially excited about in terms of that addition, that expansion, is that together with Harris County, these three counties represent more than 20% of the population of Texas.
It's amazing.
Yes.
That many people live here. Well, one last question. I know for years when Dr. Kleinberg was doing the survey, he kept talking about Houston, Houston, Houston. I happened to be county judge part of that time, and so I would always say, but it's a Harris County survey. That's right. It's not just Houston. And for those who aren't familiar, less than half the people in Harris County live inside the city limits of Houston. 2 million people live in unincorporated Harris County where they don't even have ordinance making power. And then you have another million who live in other cities like Pasadena and Baytown and Humboldt and Tomball. Will there be an effort to sort of discern differences about where people live and what they think about various issues? Because I hear all the time people move out of the city or into the city for specific reasons, and I wonder, for those of us who are interested in public policy, what we can learn from that in terms of making the city of Houston better and the whole area.
I'll say something to start with, and then Dan, you could say a little bit more. I think that's a fantastic question. That's an important question, because on the one hand, there are some differences there that we should expect to see. There's a reason why some people choose to live within the city of Houston and why some people don't. At the same time, we're all very connected. There's a lot of churn, a lot of back and forth, and actually that connectivity is one of the reasons why we're really excited about expanding to these additional counties, because years ago we weren't nearly as connected, but now it's like we're one massive blob. But Dan, you wanted to add a little bit more about the city versus non-city?
I think in many ways it's just repeating the point made about expanding the panel and how that allows for us to zoom into geographies. You know, I think one of the goals that we're going to have is that as we build out that panel is what are the different geographies that we can talk about? On the one hand, how do we distinguish between the city of Houston and the rest of Harris County, as well as other cities and towns that exist throughout the county? Also thinking about county precincts. Precinct 1, 2, 3, 4, what do those look like? Who's there? What is their opinions? How do they differ? How are they similar? And so that expansion of our panel in Harris County should provide the opportunity to have a much more nuanced conversation about ebbs and flows and similarities and differences within Harris County that right now the survey could allow for us to have, but that, again, wanting to not overstretch or overrepresent what the data's allowing for us to say. We don't necessarily always go in that direction.
Well, you know, this conversation could go on for a long time, and it's been a real pleasure to have both of you here, particularly the collaboration between the Baker Institute and the Kinder Institute, all here at Rice University together. That's one of the things that I think we all look forward to, is drawing on each other's expertise. So Ruth Turley, Dan Potter, thank you both for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Baker Briefing is brought to you by the team at the Baker Institute for Public Policy. Baker Briefing is produced by Victoria Jupp and Shannon Moriarty. AV production is led by Kevin Young. The Baker Institute for Public Policy provides meaningful policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the U.S., and the world. It is a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy research organization based in Houston, Texas. To learn more, including how you can attend a live podcast recording here on the campus of Rice University, visit us at bakerinstitute.org. And thank you very much for listening.